Grossman, longtime Houstonian, born and raised in New York. And so we'll start a little bit
You
of,
have to mention that.
well, it's because that's part of the topic of my conversation about, we'll start off with a brief interview, and then we'll do some studying in your expertise, in your field of expertise. So let's start off with a brief interview, and throughout the session, if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, we have the chat section that Maya is monitoring, or you can raise your hand in the raise your hand feature of Zoom, or just physically raise your hand and Maya will call on you when we take a break. So Rabbi Yossi, how are you today?
I'm doing great.
How are you?
Today is Lag BaOmer, and it's also my anniversary.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. So you got married. So to explain that, so lots of weddings happen on Lag BaOmer. Explain that a little bit.
Right? Yes, as we know, between Pesach and Shavuot is a time of mourning known as the Sphere period. So the custom is not to have weddings during that period. But Lag BaOmer is the one day in the middle that we do allow for a break in the morning. So many people get married on Lag BaOmer. It happened to have fallen out that year on Memorial Day too. And it was a Sunday, so everything worked out perfectly. And I'm now married for 23 years.
So shout out to your wife. Now would be a good time if you want.
Yes. We have a gift page at Amazon. I'll put up the link shortly.
Perfect, thank you. Your cutlery and dishes. So tell us a little bit about your move to Houston. In conversations with you, it seems to me that you're a proud Houstonian and really enjoy the vibe and the energy of the Houston Jewish community, and you've been successful here in many ways.
It's a matter of opinion, but
yeah, well, it's my opinion. Yeah, to tell us a little bit about your move to Houston and what that was like for you in your journey.
So we are the epitome of that family that has that bumper sticker. Wasn't born here, but got here as quick as possible. That was I moved there. Actually, today's my 23rd wedding anniversary. We moved here 22 years ago. So we were married, I think, less than a year. We moved there. So as we said, we got here as quick as possible. It was not my wife's dream. It was my dream, I have to admit. And it's taking 22 years. She's almost there by now. But we love it here. It's an awesome community. One of the beauties of the community is that we can have all the various communities get along. The Orthodox rabbis is giving a class for Brith Shalom. I actually give a class every Wednesday morning in Brith Shalom. So it's just a great community all around. Many different ways. Specifically, the Jewish community is awesome, and we love it here. There's no going back at this point. We're past the point of return. And as you know, in Houston, once you're here for 5 years, you're considered native. So so now that's it. We're done.
Beautiful. Well, I'm glad you're here. It's been great learning with you and learning from you, and so let's do that today. So one of your areas of expertise is Halakhic responsa, and so tell us about your interest in Halakhic inquiry and some of the studying you've been doing.
So honestly speaking, it's not. Well, I guess you could say it is one of my expertise, but this concept of actually teaching medical ethics only came after I moved to Houston. I moved there as a young whippersnapper rabbi. Did not know anything about medical. In yeshiva, they don't teach us anything about medical ethics.
Right.
Even not familiar with that term per se. And when I moved there was a local doctor who kept on calling, and this was the origination of Torch, asking us, can we give a class on the parsha of the week related to medical ethics? So first of all, two things. I didn't know what medical ethics was really much. And rabbis, they don't really teach us the parsha of the week too in yeshiva. So and to connect those two was totally out of my realm. But after enough bugging me, I finally caved into this doctor. I said, I'll try it. And that's actually been my longest running class in Houston was medical ethics. It's a weekly class, which is currently as we know, taking place in Brith Shalom on Wednesday morning. So a lot of the same original group was from Brith Shalom,
Mm-hmm.
many of the participants. So it's just amazing. I've learned, as they say, I think it's a quote from Rabbi Akiva, who today is part of the holiday of Lag B'Omer, where he says, "I've learned the most from my students." So there's no question I've grown immensely in my 22 years in Houston, and we're publishing a book actually from those classes that are taking place on Jewish medical ethics. So it's actually fascinating because relevant to the topic at hand. I've been teaching medical ethics now for 22 years, and what's amazing is you can teach and you can have all the knowledge, but most of it is theoretical. Now with the coronavirus in the last few months, what's going on in the world, these are actually, no one ever believed, I would never have thought that this is not just theoretical anymore. Many of the topics that we've been discussing over the last 22 years are now, unfortunately, very practical and relevant to questions that have been coming up. So it's something I never dreamed of, and obviously it's very different giving a nice class to some doctors, theoretically speaking,
Right.
when you're actually now getting practical cases on an everyday basis, where many of the things, again, nothing could have prepared us for this, in specifically medical ethics. But it's not only, as we're going to see, many of the Halakhic issues coming up during these crazy times are not only related to medical, but to many different areas, as we'll talk about. So.
All right, so you're in a unique position because you've, in effect, been preparing for this moment theoretically, and now we're ready to jump into it practically.
But it's a lot scarier talking about it practically than theoretical.
Right.
So,
okay. All right, let's do it. What do you got?
Okay, so I'll start with a brief introduction, just general, as we know, just to introduce the concept of halacha, of Jewish law, which many people don't realize it's an all-encompassing legal system. It addresses every area of life, as we're mentioning specifically today, is medical, but again, it's not limited to that. As we know, it's from ritual practice to commercial transactions to family relations, and it happens to take side tours into medical ethics and much more, as we'll see today. There's a concept in halacha, generally speaking, called horat shah, which means emergency measures. In Hebrew, the term is horat shah, and that's part of the Jewish tradition, legal tradition as well, which is there are times where crazy things happen, and we have to, so to speak, tweak the halacha to address, and many times even be more lenient than we might usually be in a halachic ruling when it comes to situations. And there's no question now, the recent global shutdown due to COVID-19 and the pandemic clearly spurred, I would venture to say, rabbinical authorities all over the world to grapple with specific and unusual questions about everything from praying when synagogues are closed, as we know, and having Zoom classes like this. All rabbis all over the world had to learn technology and how to use Zoom, where you could ask Rabbi Teller, we're all struggling with this, especially rabbis are usually deficient in technological areas. That's why we need Maya on board here.
Right.
Shout out to Maya. So, but this is something, so there's, as we know, we're all going through these chaotic times together. And specifically, I think in the rabbinical arena, they're grappling with these issues, unusual questions about, as we're saying, praying when the synagogues are closed, celebrating Passover, without being to leave your home and without being able to invite guests, etc. So I'm just going to start off by way of introduction, just to show you here what's going on. And I think we're literally, obviously, we're living in historic times, but specifically in the realm of Jewish law, there are, I would venture to say, in the last 4 to 6 weeks, or even more, last couple of months, there's been unbelievable amount of questions being asked and responses being written and answered, which responsive is basically just a halachic query. It's usually done in writing and answered in writing. So, and these are something we're probably, I would venture to say, that our grandkids are going to be studying in 100 years from now, as we study texts from previous generations addressing halachic issues. So our grandchildren will be studying these texts and seeing what applies. I mean, there's just amazing stuff that are coming up, like I said, till now, that were very much only theoretic in the theoretical realm are now very much being addressed in a practical way. So for generations on, they're going to be studying this text. There are three specific rabbis I'm going to mention who have been extremely, I would venture to say, just prolific in their writings the last couple of months relevant to this. One is a rabbi named Rabbi Asher Weiss, who is actually Canadian-born rabbi who made Aliyah probably 30 or 40 years ago. He has a yeshiva in Israel, and he actually is very involved in medical ethics in general. Prior to this, he is the Halakhic authority for Shari Tzedek Hospital in Jerusalem. So he has written extensively, just to show you. One of my technological issues is I'm not posting text in this class, too rough, but this is just 100 pages, literally 100 pages of responsa, just written over the last 4 weeks, all in Hebrew, of course. And I'll just translate it. It's called, he has many books, written responsa books, called Minchat Asher. His name is Asher Weiss. So this is Leket Shiur Mechuvas. This is a compilation of responsa and letters that were written relevant to the coronavirus. This is the third printing, meaning it's been updated as he comes out with more queries that he writes, that he answers to. Literally 100 pages here, and just the index alone on this is from the last 3 weeks, are 3 pages of just index, 4 pages here, just the index of the questions, and they cover across the board, topics across the board. That's one example, and we'll give you some of the examples he discusses. Another rabbi over the last few weeks who I've been in touch with, and an American rabbi, is Rav Hershel Schachter, who is the Rosh Yeshiva and the Dean of the YU, of the Yeshiva University's Kollel and Yeshiva, and he also has continuously answered questions over the last 4 weeks, and they've come out in print in English and Hebrew, as we'll see, and dealing with an extensive amount of issues. And the last rabbi, who actually I've also corresponded with over the last few weeks, questions that I've received from people here in Houston, is Rabbi Dr. Avram Steinberg, who is a physician himself, a world-class medical ethicist. He is also a practicing physician, but also a rabbi, ordained rabbi, an amazing man. He has published extensively. He has a 7-volume, he has two major publications. One is called Encyclopedia of Jewish Medical Ethics, which I believe is, looking at my shelf here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 volumes. And then he has another volume, which was recently printed, on all a sort of a code of Jewish law on medical ethics. So he also has dealt extensively with it. He just sent me a few days ago a 40-page Halakhic compendium on all issues related to coronavirus. Okay, so 1 second, hold on 1 second. There's a smoke alarm beeping here. I'm just going to shut the door. It's just lunch is ready. That's, as they say, dinner is ready at the sound of the smoke alarm. That's my house. Hold on 1 second.
It's part of the charm of teaching from home. Right, actually.
Everything's okay. It's not a fire drill. It's an actual
Perfect.
lunch got burnt.
That's
Yes.
toast. Yeah.
Yes, that's what happens when you have kids in the home. Okay, so again, this is just, like I said, we're living in historic times. I'm just going to go through quickly. I'm just trying to give you an overview, but I'm going to mention just a few of the topics that have come up. And again, they're not all medical. Many of them are many other areas. I'm just going to read through a small list I made here. One is an obvious question. This is something I addressed here in Houston. I've been asked this question by physicians here in Houston. Is, may a doctor who is at high risk himself, let's say an older physician or even a younger physician who has some type of pre-existing condition or has family at high risk, can he work in the current pandemic where he will be coming across patients and treating patients who have corona, where he's exposing himself, maybe endangering his own life, or of his family? Let's say there's someone else in his family who has a risk. So he comes home to his wife, he or she comes home to his wife. Or I had this with EMS, people who are first responders. I don't know if you saw, there was a news story a few weeks ago of a couple who both of them were first responders. One was a fireman, the other one was an EMS responder. and their daughter, a young daughter, I think a 6-year-old, died of coronavirus, of complications through corona. So can someone risk their own life, so to speak, or risks by exposing themselves to corona? That's quite a very important question, as we'll see soon.
So in other words, we've been appreciating them and thanking them for their courage and bravery and service. But before that, the question is it allowed?
Are they doing the right thing, right? Right. It's a fascinating question. I mean, generally speaking, it's interesting when in our society, as you're saying, in Western society, generally speaking, when someone risks their life to save someone else's life, they're heroes. And that's what of course, these first responders are heroes. In halacha, it's not so simple. I always say this in Jewish medical ethics. There are sometimes you're not supposed to risk your life to save someone else. As a matter of fact, if it's certain death, you're not supposed to kill yourself to save someone else. So you're not considered a hero. As a matter of fact, if you do that, you're a fool. It says, the Talmud says, you're a pious fool, so to speak. You think you're this big tzaddik, you're a big righteous person saving someone else's life. But if you're going to kill yourself, or you're coming home and you have corona and you're going to expose your family or family member who's at risk, so that doesn't necessarily make you a hero necessarily.
Right,
that's
so
why, by the way,
how do the sources tease out the answer?
So we'll get to that. I'm first going to mention a bunch of questions, then we'll get to the individuals. But
come on, I want to know.
All right, but it's, by the way, I just want to mention, that's why you find without getting into the politics of today's administration, but you don't find too many Jewish Secret Service agents who are ready to take the bullet for the president, or any president, not just this president for sure not, but other presidents too. I mean, besides that, usually Jewish men are shorter, but that's not the only reason. It's because you aren't necessarily allowed to take a bullet for the president, halachically speaking. So, but that's a separate class. So meaning what Western society defines as a hero is not always going to be true from the Jewish perspective. So that's one interesting point. Another question, I'm just going to go through a quick list and then we'll try to get back to some of these. So another question is obviously about a bris. I've had this question come up. How do you do a bris? Should we be doing circumcisions in the time of coronavirus? I had someone here in Houston who had a grandchild, actually in Manhattan, and they couldn't get them all to come. The mall in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, they did the bris 4 weeks late. Should we even be doing circumcisions at this time where you're going to have the malls coming from the outside? We don't know who he's exposed to, etc. So that's a question that's come up. Obviously, in Passover time, there was a lot of questions during Pesach, about selling chametz via the internet and how that works. Even should we have burning of the chametz, etc., outside? There's a lot of, believe it or not, I've had this here in Houston, mikvah questions of women who have to immerse in the mikvah. Obviously, the mikvah, how do you control that? Someone was exposed to COVID, they're asymptomatic. You're going into mikvah. Should we close down the mikvahs during this time? I had a woman who actually, there's an actual case that I had as a rabbi here in Houston, a woman who was a nurse in a hospital here, actually in a labor and delivery unit, and she was, it turns out retroactively, they didn't know, she was exposed to a patient in delivery who subsequently tested positive for COVID-19. And she's a newlywed, this woman, she called me up, she has to go to the mikvah, what should she do? So the mikvahs here in Houston actually have a policy. They will not, if you were exposed to COVID, obviously they won't let you in. And so questions what to do. It's a lot of details involved. I'm not gonna get into all the details, but one suggestion was she can go to the ocean, but it turns out she had a fear of sharks and she couldn't go to the beach at the time. So just fascinating questions that have been coming up. Just as an example.
Doesn't everybody have a fear of sharks?
No, but she doesn't go into the water. She goes to the beach. She won't go into the water ever.
Okay, fair enough.
So it wasn't an option in this case.
Yeah, it would be a reasonable fear, I guess.
Yeah, well, anyway, that's another question. Obviously, the question of under quarantine, there's many religious rituals that can't be done with a minyan, without a minyan. Can you do them on Zoom? All these questions, obviously, that have come up. I had an interesting question that I saw Rabbi Weiss discussed, which is relevant to Pesach, even though we're post-Pesach now, but it was a fascinating question. One of the symptoms, I don't know if you've read about this, of corona now, they're saying, and it's been confirmed now, in medical journals is that you lose your taste buds. You can't taste. You don't taste anything. People who have no other symptoms, actually, some people, I've had a nephew who had this in New York, and that was his only symptom. He just couldn't taste. He was totally asymptomatic, but you don't taste food. You taste nothing. So the question became, so the question posed to the rabbi was, if you can't taste the maror, can you fulfill the mitzvah of bitter herbs at the Seder if it's not bitter? He can't even taste it. Okay, fascinating question. And the rabbi ruled, by the way, because matzah also, you can't taste the matzah either. He said, but matzah, it's not about tasting it. The Torah says you got to eat matzah on Pesach, right, but it's not relevant to taste. But the whole purpose of the bitter herbs is because it's bitter. So if you have no taste buds, can you fulfill the mitzvah? And he ruled that you shouldn't make a blessing, because technically speaking, it might be questionable if you fulfill the mitzvah of maror. So just to show you the variety of questions, and some others that have come up is obviously major medical question is the triage issue. When you're dealing with triage of, as we know, there was shortage of ventilators, or concern there might be shortage of ventilators in New York State at the time, and there was a big issue. So we'll talk about that. How do you delineate who gets the ventilator, who doesn't? How do you choose situations like that? So that's a major, obviously a major question which needs to be addressed and was addressed by many leading medical ethicists and rabbis in this day and age. Again, that was something that never came up in a practical sense till now, at least in the United States. Yeah. And
it became practical for Israeli hospitals to follow the guidelines?
No, so in Israeli hospitals, it never became practical, although Rabbi Dr. Steinberg did write up guidelines. We'll talk about that. He actually, when I originally spoke to him, usually he's very good at responding to emails. I had sent him some questions. He wasn't responding. Finally, I said, I need to know, assuming by your radio silence that you agreed to what I said. And so he quickly wrote back. He said he was actually, this rabbi in Israel, he led a committee of over 20 people. It consisted of Muslims, Christians, for the Israeli government to decide to write up guidelines for these triage issues that potentially may come up. Thank God they weren't relevant in Israel. Israel, as we know, did a great job in curbing the deaths and the hospitalizations of coronavirus, one of the best probably in the world. But at the end of the day, they did have to, obviously, in case it was relevant, he did write up guidelines. So he was actually the chair of that committee, this Rabbi Steinberg. So I have that from him. Maybe we'll look at that soon. Some other issues. First of all, there's obviously mental health issues that come up during Corona times, especially everyone's stuck in their homes with their kids and their spouses spending much quality time, quote unquote quality time, that can lead to anxiety and for the parents and etc. So many mental health issues also come up, obviously, specifically in these times, which would need to be addressed. For example, one of the issues during Sefira period, specifically Halakhic issue, is many people have the custom not to listen to music, live music, even recorded music. But many of the rabbis have been saying, due to the anxiety in quarantine, especially for the moms and dads dealing with the homeschooling, they permitted listening to music just for the sanity of the parents.
That's interesting.
So that's something, yeah. So mental health issues obviously is a big issue also in our current situation.
I understand mental health was also for people who were alone for...
Oh, yes, exactly. Yes. So there was a lot of discussion about that. Even, by the way, calling people, which normally in a regular situation we won't allow, let's say just because you have an elderly parent or something who's alone, doesn't necessarily... Loneliness alone is not enough of a reason, let's say in a strict Orthodox traditional sense of calling someone on Shabbat would be prohibited. Just because they're lonely doesn't give you permission to call them. But in a case where, first of all, there might be a potential danger, meaning you want to check up on them, make sure they're okay, or let's say they had potential even symptoms or exposed to someone with the virus, to call to make sure they're doing okay during these times, was also permitted by many rabbis, which is obviously, it's a mental health issue. Even, by the way, I've seen fascinating thing, which response from Herschel Schechter allowed. It wasn't on my list. I'm going to mention it because it's not mental health per se, but as we know, when people are hospitalized, especially today with the coronavirus, they don't allow relatives in. Usually you can go visit them. There's another issue that has come up, which is Bikur Cholim, visiting someone, a sick person. Of course, during COVID-19, that's would be prohibited, halachically speaking. And there is, by the way, responsible about this during past pandemics, as maybe we'll talk about addressing this issue, that they do not allow, when you have a contagious disease, we should not be doing Bikur Cholim, obviously, even though it's a great mitzvah, visiting the sick is one of the greatest mitzvahs during pandemic times, where there's obviously the fear of contagion. It is not allowed, it's prohibited, and you shouldn't be visiting them, especially as we know, even when it comes to elderly parents, etc. So the question became, when you have patients in hospitals, where unfortunately they're not able to have visitors, so it's not only about the visitation, many times part of the Bikur Cholim and visiting a family member is advocating for them to the physicians. And since we're not able to enter the hospitals in these scenarios today, to visit them, sometimes you have to advocate by phone. So rabbis have ruled that would be permitted even on Shabbat, meaning even to call the hospital, to call the doctor on Shabbat to advocate, to make sure that they see someone cares about the patient and make sure they're being taken care of properly, would be permitted even on Shabbat, because that's something that can't be, that's different obviously in this day and age with the coronavirus, where you have to do it by phone. So it's permitted to do that on Shabbat. So we'll discuss some of that. That's also fascinating.
One more question, and then
sure.
Let's jump into some text or some specifics.
Okay.
But this could go on forever. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah. It's endless. The questions are endless, and there's new questions every single day.
Right. Yeah. Right. Rabbi Kenny Weiss is asking. Well, I'll read his question, and then we can. Sure. What is the likelihood that leniency becomes permanent, and we don't return to the previous, more stringent practice?
Question. That's an awesome question, Kenny. Wow. So this is probably one of the biggest fears, I think, during this time, it's a fascinating question. Thank you, Rabbi Weiss, for asking that. The other Rabbi Weiss actually talks about it. Rabbi Weiss I mentioned, Rabbi Asher Weiss. Are you related to him, Kenny? Maybe
No, I'm not.
Okay. Sure, you look a little like him. He just has more facial hair. But you look.
I trimmed recently.
Oh, okay. Anyway, so this is something I think it's fascinating that you bring that up, because it's been one of the fears, I think, in coming out with a lot of these halakhic rulings during this time is knowing that whatever is ruled now is, once you, as we know, let the cat out of the bag, it's very hard to go back. So the rabbi's fear is that many of these leniencies that we are allowing, maybe during this time, such as, the Zoom Seder, which was debatable, there was a big argument in the Orthodox community in Israel, whether that was allowed or not. But once you allow that, so then in the future, it's going to be very hard to put the cat back in the bag. For example, I'm also involved in one of my side businesses as a rabbi is kosher supervision. And there was a lot of leniencies within the kosher world in this Passover. Normally, Passover is a very strict time when it comes to certifying and allowing things that don't specifically need, special Passover certification, kosher Passover certification. This year, many of the kashrus organizations gave out lists of things that don't need certification, which they never would have revealed in past years. They don't need special kosher for Passover certification. Now, once you permit that, next year, I know I'm going to be using that same list from this year. I'm going to pull it. I saved it on my computer. And clearly, if it's permitted this year, it's probably permitted in the coming years. So this is something that I think they are grappling with. And but it's interesting. For example, there was a movement, as you know, there's a tradition in the Ashkenazi community not to eat kidneyot on Passover. So many people were saying this year, because of Corona, we have to be lenient on the kidneyot. We should permit kidneyot, permit the legumes, which again, it's only really a custom, and it's questionable to begin with how strong that custom is. But so Rabbi Weiss, the other Rabbi Weiss, not Rabbi Kenny Weiss, he spoke about this. I was listening to a class of his, and he said, we have to understand that just because it's coronavirus doesn't mean, okay, we're going to drop, all the stringencies we keep for Passover or whatever, even during the year, just because of the coronavirus. the ones relevant to, of course, pikuach nefesh, which is relevant to, it could be endanger someone's life, or of course, like we're saying, mental health issues, physical health. Those, of course, we couldn't agree that we're going to be lenient on. But it doesn't mean, every stringency we keep, which is not relevant to Corona, now we're going to say, okay, let's chuck it. Let's just throw it out the window. You're saying that, on the contrary, during these times of pandemic, if anything, we have to be more stringent in as religiously, and we have to show God that we care about the religion. So it doesn't mean we're going to give a carte blanche here, leniency on everything in our lives now because of Corona. So it's an important point that Rabbi Weiss, the Houston Rabbi Weiss, is bringing up. So I appreciate that, Kenny, for bringing that up. So it is something we're struggling with, because again, like we're saying, once you let the cat out of the bag, the Halakhic bag, it's very hard to put it back in. And to tell people next year, when we're past this virus, that okay, now it's prohibited. Last year was okay, so what changed? So it's a very important point.
All right, let's see how the halacha deals with some. Pick one or two, and then we'll deal.
Okay, yeah. So what time are we going to?
Well,
I can pace myself. Okay, 12:50. So I'm just going to mention two other things, because I just want to show you that it's not all medical. There's a big factor, and I don't know, you might be a sore topic, and the Rabbi might not even be happy I'm bringing this up, but there's a lot of obviously issues of monetary law that come up during Corona, because as we know, the economy is doing pretty bad, and there's a lot of issues. Just for example, and this is issues that I'm on the board of a local school here, which have come up, which is tuition issues. For example, I'm not going to mention shul dues, God forbid, but people who are struggling financially, and especially people who, let's say, as we know, there's very little school. Of course, you have Zoom school, you have school on Zoom, but people are paying, let's say, preschool. It's very hard to have preschool on Zoom, but people are paying tuition. And as we know, Jewish day schools are not cheap. Okay, so the question comes up, what happens during these times? Can people say, well, listen, you're only giving me 3 hours a day on Zoom. I signed up for my kid for 7 hours a day. So that's obviously a very big topic throughout the Jewish world. It always is, all year. Forget about Corona. Right. Jewish day school tuition is a topic all year round. But now during these times, this is obviously surfaced in the sense of parents are asking, halachically speaking, what is my obligation? Do I have to pay my tuition that I contracted when they're not servicing me to the extent that they're supposed to be serviced? Rabbi, you have something to add there?
No, that's an excellent question. Yeah, I guess. Right. I'm curious how it's an ethical issue or a legal contractual issue.
Well, it's both. So that's something we can start with that one. And by the way, in general, there's a question of violation of contract. And so, when I have, even in businesses, can I backtrack on a contract that I've signed because of Corona, whatever the case? So this is something, so Rabbi Herschel Schachter, this is something we can start with this one, because it is a very topic near and dear to my heart, but I can find it. He has it, and I'm going to read it in English. And by the way, this is fascinating also when you're dealing with different rabbinical figures. So you see how they address things from a different perspective, even within, let's say, the traditional Orthodox Jewish community, where, because Rav Hershel Schachter is an American rabbi dealing with Jews living in a non-Jewish country, as opposed to Rabbi Weiss is dealing with strictly, certainly most of his responses, I would say, they're in Hebrew, really addressed to other rabbinical decisives, but not as a communal answer. As opposed to Rabbi Schachter, who lives in New York City, many of his responses, he's writing them in Hebrew and translating them in English, because they're more addressing not just the rabbinical community, but it's addressed from the perspective of the individual and the community, which is it's very important, because living in America, you don't only have to deal with something, as you bring up, from a legal perspective. There's the issue of how will the non-Jewish community view us if we're doing X and they might not view it in the proper light. And as we've seen, unfortunately, there's been in the news, and especially in places like New York, where there's been funerals where they weren't social distancing, idiotic people, I would call them, people not doing the right thing. But the question is, sometimes if you permit, X, it could lead to a slippery slope, and people don't know how to social distance properly. And we need to be concerned not only about what the halach is, but within halacha, there's a concept of Chilul Hashem, which was actually in 2 weeks ago, the Torah's portion of Parshat Emor. Last week, I don't know where we are. in this coronavirus, but some parsha, because we're not reading the parsha this week in shul. But in any case, right? So we have to be concerned about how the non-Jewish community will view us when we're doing certain practices, if we do them in public. For example, burning the chametz. If you're going to allow during coronavirus people to go outside and have public, as they have in some Jewish neighborhoods in New York, public chametz burnings, how would that be viewed? And during this time. So that's a very important factor. Also, which I think Kenny was touching on before, which is, and that's why you answer the question differently. An American rabbi, even though it might be answering the same question in Israel, there's less of an issue of perspective of how we're going to be viewed by the non-Jewish community, because you don't have that as much, obviously, within Israel. It is a Jewish state, and people understand there's Jewish rituals. So that's a very important factor of public perception. Do we as Jews, even if it's halachically mandated, but do we go about business as usual, conducting affairs in public, while the rest of the world is, let's say, confining themselves in their homes? And even if we're doing it according to CDC guidelines or whatever it is, let's say making an outdoor minyan, which technically speaking, as we know these days, it's according to Texas health guidelines, it might be permitted within a certain way. But do we do it where, let's say the churches are not doing it yet, and how will that be perceived by the greater community, the non-Jewish community? So that's also very important, that halacha is concerned when we're living amongst Gentiles and how that's going to be perceived. So that's, I think, another very important point worth mentioning. Yes, Rabbi? So now we'll start with the tuition issue, if I can find it here, just to read you one of Rabbi Schechter's responses. See if I can find it quickly. I thought I had it here. A lot of responses, but I wonder, maybe I have it on my screen. Yeah, okay. I think this is it. I'm missing a page here. Okay, so yes, I can't find it actually. I apologize. I thought I had it here in my handout, but I'll read you. Actually, I just have the second page of the response. He ends off saying, he basically says, and this is the halacha. I have done research because I've gotten this question about tuitions, etc., and it's relevant for every Jewish parent who has kids in school. So almost all the rulings that I've seen have said that you must continue to pay tuition as long as the school is offering some type of service. Meaning, if they're offering Zoom, again, and what's interesting is, again, one of the, and I don't know if I mentioned this before, but it's fascinating to find, as we said, almost every question that comes up, even in modern times in halacha, you're always going to find some type of precedent in the past. Pandemics are not a new thing. Unfortunately for us, pandemics are new. And we would never believe that we would be involved in a pandemic. As we know, we thought we had it all solved up until recently, but clearly in past history, and that's, there were pandemics. Pandemics is not a new thing, and therefore halakha there are many responses dealing with this. And there is, even in the code of Jewish law itself, Shulchan Aruch already discusses what happens when you have what's called a contractual obligation, and even discusses actually paying a teacher for your children in that sense. And it discusses what's called a makat medina, where the government forces a shutdown. Whatever the case is, it could be because of a health issue, as in our case, and the Shulchan Aruch does discuss that. So the Shulchan Aruch says very clear, if it's an unforeseen circumstance, the Code of Jewish Law states that you still have to continue paying. It's not the fault of the employee, and therefore you have to continue to pay out. And this is what they apply here. So everyone says, again, if the school is doing everything possible to continue to service your child, so almost all the rulings I've seen till now state that you have to pay the tuition, continue to pay tuition, again, as long as they're doing some form of service. It might be less of a service, but they're doing whatever they possibly can through Zoom. So again, if there's a play group, where it's just for little kids and they're doing nothing, there's no Zoom whatsoever, so that could be questionable. But he says another interesting thing. Rabbi Schechter, I'm just going to read you. I only have the second page in front of me. He says he says that if parents would stop paying their dues and their tuition, he says this applies to shuls too, obviously to synagogues. He says obviously these institutions, our great Jewish institutions, will have to shut down due to the current and impending financial challenges. So he says, rather we must do our part to support the schools and the yeshivas and of course the synagogues to the best of our abilities in order to ensure that they will be available to serve our communities when the epidemic comes to an end. So he says doing so would be considered tzedakah for all purposes and would certainly represent the attitude that our tradition demands at all times, but especially in times of crisis and danger. So he's saying even though legally, maybe by the letter of the law, you might be able to wiggle out of some of your tuition payments or dues, but he says we have to worry as a community, obviously, and even as individuals about the Jewish institutions in town. And therefore we have an obligation to do whatever we can, if you're financially able to support the institutions, even if legally you might find yourself a loophole to get out of it. Obviously, if someone, and I can tell you from being on the board of a local school, obviously if there's a parent who lost their job and they're in a financial situation where they can't afford it, so of course that's a different story. And of course the school has to meet with them and whatever the case is and try to help them just like in other times. But as far as a community and as individuals, if we have the means, of course, we need to continue to pay tuition and our shul dues. That plug was sponsored by Rabbi Teller and the Shalom board.
No, but he added that not only is it a fee for service, like tuition, for example, there could be a question whether that's tzedakah or not, because you're paying for a service. But in this case, it sounds like any questionable fee would be tzedakah. Is that what I heard?
Right, exactly. He's saying even if, let's say your school is not providing a service, let's say it's a preschool and they're not providing any service. Again, I don't know, I don't want to, right? So now why should I have to pay? So he's saying in that case, it's surely tzedakah. We need to, if all parents would stop paying their tuition bills at the current time, clearly these institutions, just like any other business, would have to shut down. And that would be a terrible for the community at large. And therefore he says it's considered charity and we have to do our part to support these institutions during this crisis time. So,
I've heard the case that maybe our tzedakah should be funneled to more direct service kinds of things rather than communal institutions. But this says the opposite. This says we have to do both.
Well, we listen, if God willing, we're going to get through this hopefully very soon. And we're going to be on the other end of this. We need to have these institutions, right? We need to, right? I see the Federation chairman is
former chair.
Former chair.
I'm former chair.
Okay.
Just speaking, but from the knowledge base.
I noticed, by the way, that your hair got a little darker since you left that position.
Unfortunately, you can't reverse the graying, but you have to look at it. That yet another point of view is that for most institutions, 80 to 95% of their cost is personnel cost. And the schools, for example, make year-long contracts with their teachers. And the school is obligated to pay the teachers if there's a mortgage or there's rent payments or whatever.
Yes.
The variable costs are very small. In our synagogue, my guess is that we're saving a little bit on utilities, but not a whole lot more. So the institution has to continue paying its people, paying its rent, paying its mortgage, paying everything else. So it can't continue to exist if you stop making the payments. The question then is, how do you make it up? And you continue to go to people who can't afford to do it to help those who can't afford to do it. But it's from an institutional point of view, it would be disastrous if people could decide that they don't like that this service isn't rendered or that service isn't rendered.
Yes, 100%. And that's exactly what the rabbi's saying. I think you need to grow some facial hair and you might be able to give out some halachic rulings. But but the point is, you're 100% right. That's exactly what he's saying. Meaning we have to make sure our institutions last, and the only way to do that is continue to pay. So even if you might have a legal loophole, technically speaking, let's say in legalities or in halacha, to get out of it, he's saying we still have an obligation as individuals, a part of a community, to support our institutions. And as pointing out, that is there's no question the costs are almost negligible, and the costs have not gone down for many of the institutions because they're contracted, and thank God they're paying their teachers, etc. So it's a very, very valid point. So we're running out of time, so I'm gonna one other. I'm just gonna read you another email. There's two things. First of all, I'm going to read you about Dr. Steinberg. In the beginning of Corona, I had emailed him some questions that I had, but I'll read you one other email that I was in correspondence. It was my sister, actually. I don't know if you've heard. One of the fascinating things that have been going on is one of the potential remedies is when people, after people get healed from Corona, they have antibodies, and they're now being tested for antibodies, and they can donate plasma. Actually, Methodist here was involved in that study also. But actually, believe it or not, the study started in New York. As you know, unfortunately, the New York community was hit very hard. Specifically, the Jewish community in New York was hit harder than the Orthodox community in New York. So this whole concept of donating plasma and testing for antibodies was actually started by two family members of patients in New York, Orthodox guys. I happen to know both of them. And they started, this whole convincing hospitals, and they actually partnered at the end with the Mayo Clinic, who was involved in the study. And I don't know, they're pretty much, I don't know if it's proven yet, but it's pretty much one of the things that are being used is people are donating plasma, which is then given to people with coronavirus, that the plasma has the antibodies from previous hailed patients. In any case, my sister, who's in a bunker somewhere in the Poconos, her summer home, was very bored, and she volunteered to coordinate a lot of these efforts of getting people, the Orthodox community who have had Corona, to donate plasma. So she was dealing with the question of with rabbis, and she sent me some of the correspondence I was involved of what happens on Shabbat. Can I go donate plasma for patients on Shabbat, which came up, and how does that work? So I'm just going to read you a fascinating email that she sent me. This was in the middle of Passover, Erev, the second part of Passover. So this was dated Tuesday, April 14th. It's actually the copy of an email that the rabbi wrote to my sister. His name is Rabbi Wiseman, happens to be a rabbi in Brooklyn, Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva called Torah V'das. And he's writing to my sister about her question of what to tell people, potential plasma donors in the Orthodox community who are Shomer Shabbat, and how they should deal with donating plasma. I'm just going to read you, it's just a fascinating email just to show you how lenient they are when it comes to many of these issues, and in this case, violating Shabbat. So it says it's dated Tuesday, April 14th, Halakhic guidelines for plasma antibody donors. And it says, Erev Yom Tov Sheni. This morning I spoke with Rabbi Reuven Feinstein, this is Rabbi Reisman writing this, with the infectious disease specialists who have been guiding us throughout. So this is another key point when you, very important to understand, I just want to clarify this, we're almost out of time, is that whenever you have to make a halachic decision, this is key point to understand when it comes to medical ethics, or is the rabbi cannot make a decision without obviously consultation with the medical professionals. Rabbis are very important people, and I don't mean to demean any rabbis here online, but at the end of the day, we're not doctors, except if you're a rabbi and an MD, but most rabbis are not MDs. And therefore, the halachic decisions have to be based on the medical realities. Halacha is not just it's not a nice guessing game. They're based on facts. The halacha has to be based on facts. So based on the risk involved and based on the procedure, the rabbis have to be in consultation with the doctors before ruling on any medical halachic decision. This is the key thing, and that key thing in all halachic areas and all year round, but specifically here. So he says very clearly, they were in consultation with infectious disease specialists. Without that, you cannot have halachic ruling. If you know of any rabbi who rules on a medical issue without consultation with the doctors, you should not accept his ruling. So that's a key point. So he says, going into Yom Tov Sheni, the second part of Passover, these are the guidelines. He says, if you are donating plasma, which is designated for a specific patient, he says you may drive on the holiday to donate. That means just to make the plasma donation, they were allowing people to drive and to violate Shabbat in those communities, which that are traditionally Shomer Shabbat. He said you also drive back unless it is a brief period. He says not only that, you can not only drive to donate the plasma, he says you're allowed to drive back to coming back home, because obviously in these days you can't stay in the hospital. They don't allow you to stay there or in the clinic, and there's danger of contagion. So he says you're allowed to drive back unless he says it's within an hour before Shabbat is over, in which case you should try to wait in your car before driving back if need be. He says there are circumstances where donation to a designated patient requires us to provide numerous donors. So he says even if you know many patients are donating to this specific patients, many other donors, not many patients, many donors are donating, you're still allowed to violate Shabbat to go and donate. It is important to point out that the preliminary information indicates that the earlier a patient receives the plasma, the more likely it is that he will recover. Therefore, we should not be delaying. And that's why you have to go even on Shabbat, which, by the way, since this was written on April 14th, it has changed because now they have so much plasma in the bank that they don't need, there's no emergency to donate your plasma. So now he would not permit violating Shabbat. And he goes on to say, if you're donating to a hospital or just to a bank and not to a designated recipient, so he says on the first day of Yom Tov, which is a biblical holiday, you should avoid doing a biblical violation, and you should try to either go by Uber or have a non-Jew drive you. He says, but he says you may leave your phone on to receive information. It goes on and on. Just fascinating to see again how lenient they were at the time. So I think we're out of time, but there's, like I said, we can go on for hours discussing these fascinating questions. We're living in unprecedented times, and hopefully we'll get through them, and we won't have to discuss these in a practical way, many of these questions, but if you go back to discussing them theoretically very soon, and that's my blessing that all of us should be on the other side of this and not have any of these questions come up in a practical way.
Amen. Thank you. Just last question is,
Sure.
one of the decisions that all shuls and schools and institutions are going to have to make is the reopening conversations. Have you had any of those preliminary conversations about what the halachic process would be for that question about reopening?
So you're talking about from the health perspective, the community health perspective, or from the ritual perspective?
Both. The first step would be to check with I'm assuming, like as you mentioned,
yes.
rabbis would check with the doctors, get some guidelines.
And 100%. Everything needs to be done. Number one, as we mentioned, in consultation with the Harris County health authorities, which I think the HRA has been doing to a certain extent. But again, the second part is, and I think I stress this even more before we get to the ritual part, is the Chil Hashem aspect of it. We have to be so careful as a Jewish community of how it's going to be perceived by the greater community. If people see us outside, in the parking lot praying, even if you have a contained parking lot, and then God forbid someone that did attend a minyan, and even an outdoor minyan, which was keeping the guidelines set out by the medical authorities, get sick, and then that makes the news, how will that look for the community at large? So that's a key part, which I think is, again, after the medical facts are in. And even if as we know, there's debate even within our very own state of what we're opening. As we know, many of the allowances and permission are not based on medical facts, but are based on economics issues. So that's something that, and I want to clarify that. Actually, Rabbi Usher Weiss said this in the questions about opening up. He said very clearly that Judaism doesn't risk anyone's life for any economic factors. Of course, there is a concept of community versus individual, and that's something that's obviously very beyond my pay scale for today's class, but it's something that needs to be addressed. There is a concept of economics of a community versus individual life, maybe, and there are sources that discuss that. But again, in Judaism, when there's risk to life, economics, of course, risk to life is the overriding factor. And therefore, just because, let's say, our state government is deciding this is now permitted, doesn't mean it's actually halachically permitted. That's number one. And then, like we're saying, even after the facts maybe do allow it, the medical facts, medical realities might allow it, we have to take into account how it's going to be perceived, and God forbid if someone does catch it, and how would that affect us. So I think that's key in all of this. And the other thing that I didn't mention, which is it's a fascinating thing that, as you know, and by the way, there was a phone call that I was privy to. Dr. Fauci actually had a phone call with the Orthodox Union, I think it's now a week and a half ago. And on that phone call, they were talking about actually the high holidays and guidelines from Dr. Fauci himself to the OU about is the high holiday, should we reopen or not? And he, by the way, was permissive. he said, obviously with guidelines and how to do it. And you can go to I can get a hold of that. You need that. I can get a hold of that conversation. I'm sure it was recorded. But one of the things that came up there and from the OU was, it was interesting. The president of the OU said to Dr. Fauci Dr. Fauci said, listen, if you have 6 feet space, you're having it in wide open space where they'll be able to be 6 feet between each congregant and wearing masks, etc. So the rabbi and the OU said to Dr. Fauci, I believe this is a key point also, which is for Jews, we're too social. If we say 6 feet, it's going to end up being 4 feet. So we're going to only allow 8 feet between the people, and then maybe it'll be 6 feet between the congregants. So no, it's another thing. It's a slippery slope. Once we start, as we're seeing here today in our state and also in Israel, once you start being permissive, it's a slippery slope because people think, they take the guidelines less seriously because they view it as, okay, it's back to normal life. And it's very hard, and especially as Jews, I think socially, it's very hard to keep the social guidelines. You haven't seen someone, let's say we reopen for the holidays and you haven't seen someone in 3 months now or 4 months, it's very hard not to say, to go in and, you get ready to hug him. And even though we're wearing masks, so that's another thing that has to be taken into account, I think, of the slippery slope. Once you start permitting, even with the medical guidelines, that can lead to, I think, people not taking the seriousness of the issues at hand. So.
Right, enforcement is going to be an issue.
Yes, right.
Creating guidelines is one issue, and then how to enforce it.
Exactly. No, and I think people clearly take it less serious. Which, by the way, you find precedent. I'm just going to mention this quickly. I wanted to talk about this. We're out of time. I'm just going to mention quickly. There was famous.
We're going to have you back. We're going to have you back again. So
okay, so we'll talk about
that.
No,
go ahead. Finish on that.
No, so I'll save it for next time. I won't give away the punchline, but there was a famous story in 1848. There was a cholera pandemic in almost many of the world, much of Europe at the time, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and in Vilna at the time there was a famous story of Yisrael Salanter, who was the founder of the father of the Musar movement, got up in shul during that year, famous legendary story, and he made Kiddush on Yom Kippur from the bima, and he ate, and he said everyone has to come up to the bima and partake and eat on this Yom Kippur. And he allowed it even for healthy people. So there's a lot of debate in why he allowed it. But one of the reasons given, I'll just say it and we'll talk about it maybe in a different class, was because he felt like if the healthy people don't eat, then the sick people are not going to eat. And that's the reason why he allowed, everyone must break their fast, because if not, the sick people won't take it as seriously. And they're not going to want to break their fast in Kippur. Therefore, he said everyone must eat. And he himself, who was healthy at the time, ate himself and made Kiddush, according to one legend of the story. There are different versions, of course.
Right.
But
there's a human nature piece to this.
Yes,
right?
yes, a big human nature piece, 100%. Right. So thank you very much. And again, like you say, hopefully the next time we meet, it will all be theoretical questions and not practical.
That's true. That's true. Okay. Yasher koach, Rabbi Yossi. Thank you for your expertise. And well, let's let everybody say hello for a minute. Let's unmute everybody. And we like to schmooze afterwards. This is our schmooze time.
As long as it's social distancing and you're schmoozing.
Yeah. Easy to social distance on Zoom. So thank you very much. And yes, as I said,
we'll
have you back.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I think probably for the reopening conversations, it'd be very helpful to have you frame it in the Halakhic process as part of our process. Obviously, we have the medical part of it and we have the synagogue leadership part of it, but the Halakhic part of it, I think will shed some light on.
Yes. Okay. It was an honor and a pleasure. Thank you.
Toda.
Thank you.
Good to see everybody.